Good day. This is the recorded lecture for Week 7, Chapter 12. Chapter 12 continues with the biodiversity study and looks at preserving landscapes. So our focus will be on landscapes for this chapter. This is the outline of what is in the chapter. So I don't think I've mentioned this for a couple of lectures, but I think it's also very important that you go through your reading as well as listening to these lectures. And as always, I record the entire lecture because I think there's less lectures to access on the CCC Confer site, but you can use the playback tools to go through parts of the lecture or listen to it in parts. Read the case study in your book about Indonesia's efforts to reduce deforestation. Preserving biodiversity is not just about species, but it's the habitats they live in. So preserving landscapes is an important area of focus. And in addition to protecting species, these landscapes provide another great benefit, including reducing emissions and sequestering carbon and some of the other things that we have talked about and we will talk about in future chapters. The United Nations Collaborative Program on Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation is probably one of the more important international programs aimed at combating climate change and preventing the wide destruction of forests around the world. In short, it's called UNRED. So you may want to take a look at that. I put some information about it on your website. We need wild places as well as the resources they produce. Many conservation debates have concerned protection or use of forest, prairies, and rangelands. So this chapter examines the way we use and we abuse these particular types of biological communities, as well as some of the ways we can protect them and conserve their resources. We discuss forests first, followed by grasslands, and then look at some strategies for conservation and preservation. Your book mentions China's Hangduan Mountains, and I know about this area, being interested in floristry. This is one of the areas where most of the flower products that we would recognize in our landscapes or in our flower arrangements come from. Part of the mountains are in an alpine conifer ecoregion where many of the world's flowers and flowering landscape shrubs originate. The dense, pristine forest, the relative isolation from the development until recently, and the fact that most of the area remained free of glaciation during the ice ages provides a very complex habitat with a high degree of biological diversity, as you can see here. This mountainous region is also the home to the rare and endangered giant panda. Other species native to the mountains are the Chinese yew and various other rare plants, deer, and primates. Environmental groups have recognized this ecoregion as being threatened by a growing human population and the resulting demand for non-timber forests and wildlife products and for medicinal and other uses. This is just a reminder of some of the concepts we've talked about already in the context of landscapes. This chart is a reminder from the earlier presentations of how important some of our forests and ecosystems are for sequestering carbon. So let's look at forests. Forests are widely distributed, but the largest remaining areas are in the humid equatorial regions and the cold boreal forests of high latitudes. 5 countries, Russia, Brazil, Canada, and the United States, and China, together have more than half of the world's forests. World land use and forest types are kind of shown in this figure. The other category includes tundra, desert, wetlands, and urban areas. Here are some statistics about the world's forest. About 4 billion hectares are in forest, and half of the world's forests are in these countries, as I mentioned. We still depend on forest products for wood, paper, and fuel. This figure, figure 12 in your book, shows the major forest types. Some of the forests are dense, that is with lots of trees, and others may have only 10 to 20% actual tree cover. Since we've all covered some of the biomes, you can probably take a look and understand which forests are more dense than others. This figure shows the net change in forest area from 2000 to 2005. The largest annual net deforestation rate in the world is currently Africa. This is largely because China has planted 50 billion trees in the past decade, and so Asia has a net increase in forest area. Europe is also gaining a little bit. This is a chart showing the percentage of forest area designated for conservation. About 12% of all the world's forests are now in some form of protected status, but the effectiveness of the protection varies greatly. So you can look at North America, and we're doing reasonably well at that. When studying landscapes, and particularly forests, one of the problems we used to have is that some areas of the world were difficult to access. But with GIS systems, we are able to study landscapes in places we never could before. This is a GIS display of the increase in logging concessions in Gabon, Central Africa. On May 15th, the West African nation implemented a total ban on log exports. According to the International Timber Trade Organization, the ban has been efficiently enforced to date, and log exports have been completely halted. You can read more about this issue in the book, and also this country joined the UN UNRED program. This is a Google Earth display that I pulled down showing the areas of logging also that I could find on Google Earth. By overlaying these GIS layers, analysts can identify priority conservation areas of extensive original forest, which were high in biodiversity and rare species. So overlaying these priority areas with a map of protected lands and a map of timber concessions, they can identify areas that need priority in terms of protection. So GIS, Geographic Information Systems, has become an essential tool for conserving forests, grasslands, and ecosystems and nature preserves. GIS has revolutionized the science of planning and conservation, examining problems using quantitative data, just as it may have revolutionized the way you plan a driving trip. One of the reasons I suggest you use Google Earth to display your Raven data is to expose you to GIS technology. Nearly 12% of all the world's forests are now in some form of protected status. But the effectiveness of that protection varies greatly. Nominally, Africa has the largest percentage of area in conservation reserves. Many of those parks and reserves, though, have little practical protection, however. Park rangers are often outmanned and outgunned by poachers, drug runners, invading militias, and others who threaten the forest and its inhabitants. Costa Rica has one of the best plans in the world for forest guardianship. Costa Rica is attempting not only to rehabilitate the land, but also to restore the ecosystems to naturally occurring associations. One of the best known of these projects is Dan Jansen's work in Guanacaste National Park. Like many dry tropical forests, the northwestern part of Costa Rica has been almost completely converted to ranch land. By controlling fires, however, Jansen and his co-workers are bringing back the forest. One of the keys to this success is involving local people in the project. Jansen also encourages grazing in the park. Those of us in developed countries can also contribute toward saving tropical forests. Financing nature protection is often a problem in developing countries where the need is greatest. One promising approach is called debt for nature swaps. Banks, governments, and lending institutions now hold nearly $1 trillion in loans to developing countries. Sustainable forestry is an important part of forest preservation. In the 1990s, the U.S. Forest Service began to shift its policies from a timber production focus to an ecosystem management focus, which attempts to integrate sustainable ecological, economic, and social goals in a unified systems approach. Some of the principles of this new philosophy include managing across whole landscapes, watersheds, or regions over ecological timescales, considering human needs and promoting sustainable economic development in communities, maintaining biological diversity and essential ecosystem processes, utilizing cooperative institutional arrangements, generating meaningful stakeholder and public involvement in facilitating collective decision-making, adapting management over time based on conscious experimentation and routine monitoring. Some critics argue that we don't understand ecosystems well enough to make practical decisions in forest management on this basis. They argue that we should simply set aside large blocks of untrammeled nature to allow for chaotic, catastrophic, and unpredictable events. Others see this new approach as a threat to industry and customary ways of doing things. Still, elements of ecosystem management appear in the National Report on Sustainable Forests, prepared by the U.S. Forest Service, which I have uploaded on your website. That report suggests that the U.S. forests are stable and showing modest increases under this management approach. As we do in many of the chapters, we look at what can you do. So here's a list. Reuse and recycle paper products. Use email and store things in digital form. Conserve wood and use regenerated composites when you can. Buy from sustainable wood companies. Don't buy products made from tropical hardwoods. Don't buy products from unsustainable sources. This can be difficult at times, but try. Look for fair trade, sustainable logos. Buy range-fed beef, range chickens, and eggs. Practice minimum impact camping and hiking, and encourage environmental politics. So that's a brief look at forests. Now we're going to look at grasslands. The grasslands of the world cover, if you look at rangelands and grasslands, which may include some shrublands and savanna types, cover about half of the world's land area. So it's an important biome, or a collective of biomes. About 3.8 billion acres of grassland. Many of these areas are grazed. Grazing can be sustainable or damaging, depending on how you do it. Ranchers are experimenting with new methods to produce livestock products, but also maintain the grasslands. Grazing on public lands is regulated by the Forest Service or the Bureau of Land Management, but private lands have few grazing regulations. There's another important piece of legislation that you might hear about in California, and that is the Williamson Act, which is a tax break given to ranchers and forest owners who preserve their lands in forest and rangeland rather than convert it to agriculture. This is a slide just showing you some of the typical types of grazing animals, focused on the U.S. here on the left, and some interesting livestock breeds from other parts of the world. They vary quite a bit, but when you drive along the freeways, even fairly close to the Bay Area, you'll see these different grazing animals. These do not include dairy cattle. So this is the Black Angus, the Hereford. A cross between the Black Angus and the Hereford called a Baldy. You may not see these white cows that often, but they're called Charolais, and these are where most of your commercial steak products come from. These Charolais produce a larger steak cut than your sort of regular beef cattle. The Red Angus is also shown here in the Texas Longhorn. Scottish Highlands are, of course, grazed in Scotland, and this is another grazing animal called the Ankoli Watusi. So grazing breeds develop vary around the world. Rangeland soil degradation due to overgrazing and other causes is shown in this chart. Notice that in Europe, Asia, and the Americas, farming, logging, mining, urbanization are responsible for about 3/4 of all the soil degradation. In Africa and Oceania, where more grazing occurs, and desert and semi-arid scrub make up much of the rangeland, grazing damage is higher. Parks and preserves are important not just for forests. Many nations have created parks. You know, our National Park Service is not necessarily tied with forest lands. Many of our national monuments preserve grasslands, and we also have national grasslands. Also, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service maintains a wildlife refuge system, which includes sort of non-timbered lands in some cases, but very often wetlands. This is a chart depicting growth of protected areas worldwide, and you can see that it's increasing over time. Although most forests and grasslands serve a utilitarian purpose, many nations have set aside some natural areas for ecological, cultural, or recreational purposes. Some of these preserves have existed for thousands of years. 12% of the land area of the Earth is protected in some sort of park, preserve, or wildlife management area, but only 12%. This represents about 19.6 million hectares, or 7.6 million square miles, in some 107,000 different preserves. I think this is an important thing personally, to preserve as much land with intact ecosystems as possible. We as humans can redesign and reinvigorate our built environment, but why at this point should we be developing new land? This chart this table represents different levels of protection. The World Conservation Union divides protected areas into 5 categories depending on the intended level of allowed human use. In the most stringent category, little or no human impact is allowed. In some strict nature preserves where particularly sensitive wildlife or natural features are located, human entry may be limited to scientific research groups that visit on rare occasions. In some wildlife sanctuaries, for example, only a few people per year are allowed to visit to avoid introducing invasive species or disrupting native species. In the least restrictive categories, national forests and other natural resource management areas, there may be a high level of human use. That doesn't take away from the importance of their preservation, however. And in this country, for example, national forests are often placed next to national parks. So the national forests provide some buffers for those national parks. So this is a table showing world protected areas. Collectively, according to the World Commission on Protected Areas, Central America has 22.5% of its land area in some protected status. The Pacific region, at 1.9% nature preserves, is both the lowest percentage and the lowest total area. With land scarce on small islands, it's hard to find space to set aside for nature sanctuaries. Some biomes are well represented in nature preserves, while others are relatively unprotected. The next figure on the next slide shows the percentage of each major biome in protected status. Not surprisingly, there is an inverse relationship between the percentage converted to human use where people live and the percentage protected. With few exceptions, the percent of each biome converted to human use is roughly inverse to the percent protected in parks and preserves. Rock and ice lakes and the Antarctic ecoregions are excluded from this data. Marine systems need greater protection. Coral reefs are one of the most threatened in the world, and recall again that primary production chart that I gave you that shows coral reefs are very important in terms of the volume of primary production that they contribute. Marine sanctuaries are important, and coastal zone protection laws are also important. A coral reef is one of the most diverse and one of the most endangered ecosystems. Coral reefs are among the most threatened marine ecosystems in the world. Remote sensing surveys show that living coral covers only about 285,000 kilometers, and that translates to about 110,000 square miles, or an area about the size of Nevada. This is less than half of the previous estimates, and 90% of all reefs face threats from rising sea temperatures, destructive fishing methods, coral mining, sediment runoff, and other human disturbance. In many ways, coral reefs are the old-growth rainforests of the ocean. Biologically rich, these sensitive communities can take a century or more to recover from damage. Some researchers predict that if current trends continue, in 50 years, there will be no viable coral reefs anywhere left in the world. So sustainable development is the goal. There are some good models for sustainable development, for example, the sustainable forestry principles that we discussed earlier. Biological resources can also be economic, for example, ecotourism. Marine sanctuaries can be very important, and they can provide commercial and recreational values. Coastal zone protection laws can also help protect these areas. And your book also discusses what we call the SLOS debate. The SLOS debate in ecology and conservation biology during the 1970s and 1980s was a discussion on whether a single large or several small, that's where the SLOS acronym comes from, reserves were a superior means of conserving biodiversity in fragmented habitats. In 1975, Jared Diamond suggested some rules for the design of protected areas based on a book by Robert MacArthur and E.O. Wilson, The Theory of Island Biogeography. One of his suggestions was that a single large reserve was preferable to several small reserves whose total areas were equal to the larger. Since species richness increases with habitat area, a large block of habitat would support more species than any of the smaller blocks. This idea was popularized by many other ecologists and has been incorporated into most standard textbooks in conservation biology and was used in real-world conservation planning. This idea was challenged by Wilson's former student, Daniel Simberloff, who pointed out that this idea relied on the assumption that smaller reserves had a nested species composition. It assumed that each larger reserve had all the species presented in a smaller reserve. If the smaller reserves had unshared species, then it was possible that two smaller reserves could have more species than a single large reserve. So this is a model biosphere reserve. Traditional parks and wildlife refuges have well-defined boundaries to keep wildlife in and people out. Biosphere reserves, by contrast, recognize the need for people to have access to resource areas. Critical ecosystem areas are preserved in the core. Research and tourism are allowed in the buffer zone, while sustainable resource harvesting and permanent habitations are situated in the multiple use area around the perimeter. The other interesting concept, and this is one that I think has some real promise, is using corridors around a core area to allow for routes of migration. So linking isolated populations of plants and animals in scattered nature preserves, that is, these small nature preserves that are connected. Although individual preserves may be too small to sustain viable populations, connecting them through river valleys and coastal corridors can facilitate interbreeding and provide an escape route if local conditions become unfavorable. Your book talks about the Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative, which is one of the larger areas of a corridor connection concept talked about in the previous slide. This conservation initiative attempts to connect the green protected areas with a wider white area where migrations can occur and species protections can occur. It doesn't mean that some of these lands aren't used for other purposes, but there's a lot of work being done on setting up conservation easements and other vehicles so landowners can provide species protection without giving up their land and still allowing for economic uses. One of the important aspects of this is preserving landscape diversity. And you can see in this shot here that this is a diverse landscape in Yellowstone with edges, escape cover, access to water. So landscapes have to be diverse as well. Now what do you do with these barriers to migration? you can construct a wildlife corridor, and you can use animal bridges to allow animals to get across some of these human-created barriers. This is a figure talking about some spatial variables examined in landscape ecology. And this is where you have to look at the species, you have to look at the landscape, you have to look at the habitat and come up with the best plan that you can. Size, arrangement, context, and other factors often vary simultaneously. Together they can strongly influence the ability of a wildlife preserve to support rare species. Here's another what can you do chart looking at ecotourism. Learn about the area you are going to visit. Stay on designated trails and follow park rules. Minimize your consumption of fuel, food, and water. Respect local customs. Don't harass and feed wildlife. Find a way to contribute to the park, local economy to support ecotourism rather than resource damage. And if you can, support preservation of lands and parks. So this is our last slide, and in summary, forests and grasslands cover nearly 60% of the global land area. The vast majority of humans live in these biomes, and we obtain many valuable materials from them. And yet these biomes are also the source of much of the world's biodiversity on which we depend for life-supporting ecological services. How can we live sustainably on our natural resources while also preserving enough nature so these resources can be replenished is one of the most important questions in environmental science today. There is some good news in our search for a balance between exploitation and preservation. Although deforestation and land degradation are continuing in some developing countries, many places are still more thickly forested now than they were 2 centuries ago. Protection of Indonesia's rainforest and Australia's Great Barrier Reef shows that we can choose to protect some diverse areas in spite of forces that want to exploit them. Another example of this is the state of Vermont has restored 90% of its forest cover since the settlers just arrived. Although the level of protection of these preserves varies, the rapid recent increase in number and area and protected status exceeds the goals of the United Nations Millennium Project. We haven't settled the debate between focusing on individual endangered species versus setting aside representative samples of habitat, but pursuing both strategies seem to be working. Protecting charismatic umbrella organisms such as the spirit bearers of the Great Bear Rainforest can result in preservation of innumerable unseen species. At the same time, protecting whole landscapes for aesthetic or recreational purposes can also achieve the same end.